Professor, can you hear us? I'm Muhammad Consolia, and we have made an organizer. Can you hear us? Professor, can you hear us?
Professor, can you hear us? Professor, can you hear us? Нет, ее включено. Напишите.
У нас работает проверка, что выключилось. Можно написать? Всем конференции.
Вы текст закройте. Текст закройте.
Она не смогла бы присоединиться.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you hear us?
I can hear you well.
All right, thank you. Could you please share your screen? Yes, yes, we can. Could you? Can you hear us?
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Would you like me to close it or leave it there?
You can leave it as it is. Thank you.
Okay, fine.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, we're going to start with you the first. I would like to introduce.
Можете конца не выключить. Звук.
So I'd like to introduce Penny Earth, the author of the very famous book, 100 Teaching for Teachers. That's the very famous book published by Cambridge. And if you wish, you can get one with the autograph of the time of Penny Earth after the conference. And also, we have announced that book raffle competition. Book raffle, you'll get one copy with autograph of the writer for free. Now, I would like to give turn to Penny Earth, Professor Penny Earth from Israel, one of the well-known experts of her field. So she will be making a presentation about 7 controversies in English language teaching. So I would like to give turn to Professor Penny Earth.
Please. We're waiting for you, Dr. Orr.
Okay, I could only just hear your last sentence. I couldn't hear anything before then. So I didn't hear the introduction, but I assume you now know who I am. I'm going to be talking about 7 controversies in English language teaching. You will have seen the particular topics I'm talking about in the abstract, but I'll put them up on the screen now anyway, just to remind us all. These 7, they're talking about task-based instruction versus traditional, and online teaching versus face-to-face, use of mother tongue, the sources of teacher knowledge, experience versus research, the native speaker as opposed to the non-native speaker as the model for our learners, error correction versus non-error correction during fluent speech, and finally, the controversy over textbooks, whether they're useful or whether they de-skill the teacher. Can you tell me if you can hear me okay? Just wave at me or right. Okay, thank you very much. So that's clear. Okay, for each of these topics then, what I'll be doing is looking at what the topic is and what the issues are. And the evidence, I'll be talking about some of the research evidence for and against. And then finally, I'll give my own position, how I think the controversy may be resolved. But this is a very personal position, not necessarily accepted by a lot of the experts out there. So let's start then. Task-based instruction become fairly popular in the last couple of decades in the 21st century, and it's contrasted with traditional methods. I'll clarify in a second. So task-based instruction then claims that language is best learned as an outcome of the performance of communicative tasks. If you, particularly in pair and group work, if you're talking with other people, this is how, or listening to other people, this is how you best learn language. It's a sort of reaction against the traditional grammar-oriented methods. How I was taught French, for example, in a British school as a child, very traditional. I'll come on to exactly what that means in a moment. And task-based instruction accords with learner-centered postmodernist approaches. It's sort of fashionable, it's in, it harmonizes with general language teaching approaches in the 21st century. And there is research which supports it, particularly going back to the 1980s, 1990s, the interaction hypothesis, the hypothesis that you learn a language best by interacting with other people. And more recently, there's been some research to show that in a lot of contexts, it does work very nicely. Ellis has published quite a lot on task-based instruction, and Brifonsky and McKay in 2019 also looking at task-based instruction implemented in different contexts and finding that it has been effective. However, that's not the end of the story. Let's go back to traditional methods. The traditional way we have taught English in previous generations is based on the idea that a new language, in instructional settings anyway, not in the sort of natural immersion situation, but instructional settings in schools and colleges and universities, is best learned through direct instruction. You teach the students the words, you teach them the grammar, you teach them the meanings and pronunciation and so on, and that's how they learn, rather than just interacting with other speakers of the language. And the PPP model also has been popular under traditional methods. The idea that you present new language, you give students opportunities to practice it, and then you require them to produce it. All this very traditional, and there's research actually to support this as well. So you've got the research both sides. A much quoted study by Norris and Ortega, a meta-analysis of lots and lots of research studies on the teaching of grammar, found quite clearly that explicit teaching of grammar, actually telling students this is how the grammar works and let's practice it, does have a positive effect on acquisition. And Laufer, 2005, and indeed elsewhere, and since then, has found the same vocabulary. If you teach the vocabulary, students learn it, rather than just letting them become exposed to it through interaction. Swan, 2005, wrote a blistering attack on task-based instruction, in which he also brought some other research which opposes it. So some concessions are accepted by both sides. Both sides accept that task-based instruction allows for some focus on form, what they call focus in form, in incidental teaching of grammar and vocabulary. And traditional methods allow for the inclusion of communicative tasks in the 4 skills. It's not a question of black and white, it's a question of focus, syllabus, and priorities. What is your main goal? There's no conclusive evidence that task-based instruction is consistently better, nor is the conclusive evidence, in fact, that traditional is consistently better. There doesn't seem to be any, there's a lot of evidence for and against, and nothing really conclusive. Anecdotal evidence of success and failure in different contexts. But on the whole, not widely accepted or used in textbooks. Textbooks mostly are based on a more traditional model. And there has been some research that shows in Asian contexts, not so task-based learning is not so effective. So where does that leave us? Okay, so let's come in a second to my position. But first, in general, as I said before, there hasn't been any research that conclusively shows that one method is better than another. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what you feel as a teacher, your personal ideology and beliefs about language learning, because what you believe is likely to work for you. It depends on your own professional experience as a teacher and indeed as a learner. It depends on the local context, what is acceptable in the local context, and whether it's an English-speaking or non-English-speaking environment, and the age and level of students and the local culture of learning and preferences. My own position then, in my own teaching, and I'm teaching in a country where English is not spoken outside the classroom very much. The way I teach in school is predominantly the traditional. When I've taught academic English, I've shifted towards a more task-based model, and in both cases, borrow occasional procedures from the other. So that's where I am on this, and I don't think there's any clear decision. This is overall better or this is overall worse. And this sort of conclusion is going to be similar in many of the other issues I'm going to be looking at. Let's go on to number 2, online teaching versus face-to-face. Well, in favor, we've got current approaches. In general, people are saying you should be using computers, you should be using online teaching. This is where we're at in the development of the profession. So there's a sort of general favorable approach towards online. Necessity during the pandemic era, we had no choice. I don't know what it was like in Uzbekistan, but in my country, for a long time, children were not going to school at all, or universities for that matter, and we were only teaching through Zoom. So necessity is another factor in favor. Convenience, it's very convenient to learn online. It's firstly the availability to a much larger population of learners. You can reach lots of people, as indeed we are today, reaching more people than we could if it was only face-to-face. Low cost. It doesn't cost so much in terms of travel and the maintenance of classrooms and so on. Saving in time, again, travel. You just sit down at your computer and you don't have to go to another place. And comfort, it's comfortable. But the key question is online learning effective? How effective is it compared to face-to-face? And here, the research in most situations tends, although you find a lot of controversy here, you find some studies where it's been very successful and others where it hasn't. But if I look at the bottom line, and I've looked at a lot of studies on this, the bottom line seems to be that face-to-face produces better learning outcomes. I don't know what your experience is as teachers yourselves, but mine also is that face-to-face teaching tends to be better. It tends to get better learning. Most of the research has been on university students in various subjects. And I'll give you, at the end of this presentation, I'll give the bibliography, and in any case, I've made this presentation available to the organizers of the conference, and I hope you'll be able to access it. In schools, similar results, and the reasons seem to be very much based on the physical presence of teacher and students interacting in the same real space and time. I won't read this out, need you to read it yourselves. This is an online article by a guy who gives all the reasons why online is good. And then in his final paragraph, he says what we see here. Despite all the positives, I think we'd all being in a classroom is better. And another quote from university teaching, where they found that the factor that correlates most highly with gains is the personal, physical, geographical contact with the teachers. Physical presence implying visibility. You can see someone much better. You'd be able to see me better if I was actually standing there than just a face on a screen. You can see the body language. There's no way in Zoom one can see all the body language of the students. Facial expression is much clearer if you're physically there. The mobility and activity, obviously you're limited to your chair when you're sitting opposite a screen. Monitoring of group work, question of attention. It's much more difficult to attend to a screen than it is online, face-to-face. Awareness of student behavior. And finally, you're not dependent on the technology. So one of the problems with online teaching is some of the technology lets you down. There is a phenomenon also called Zoom fatigue. I don't know how many of you have experienced this. I certainly have as well. But if you teach hours on end on screen, you get tired in a way that you don't get tired in face-to-face. There's been some research in the last 2 years during the pandemic, and in general, it appears that achievement was lower. Some reasons why there was dropout. You have students not attending sessions or attending sessions and then turning off their camera and just moving away, and you don't know if they're there or not. So ensuring participation, eliciting individual responses is much more difficult online, as is giving individual feedback. Can be done, but it's more tricky. Building relationships, really you need to be with someone in the same room in order to build a real personal relationship with them. And as I said before, Zoom fatigue. My position on this, I think online learning is important, maybe even essential. But it supplements, it cannot completely replace face-to-face. This is what I think. It's a help. It can never be exactly the same or reach the same results in terms of learning outcomes as can face-to-face teaching. And the issues which need to be addressed urgently in online teaching are the ones you see on the screen there. So we're on to number 3. Number 3 is use of L1 versus avoidance of L1. What do you feel about these? I'm going to take a second break for the moment. And those of you who are face-to-face in the room, just talk to your neighbor for a second and discuss whether you agree or disagree with these statements that you see on the screen. Those of you who are online, maybe you'd like to write your responses in the chat box. Okay, I've no way of knowing how much you've spoken or whether you have. I'll move on and say what, in general, I hear from teachers worldwide on this topic. On the whole, teachers feel that students L1 should be avoided in the English classroom on the whole, but they do in fact use it and feel guilty about it. This is what's going on out there. I don't know how much this accords with your own experience. You'll tell me later, I hope. Research talks about academic learning time, saying that the more time spent actually learning a language, the more will be learned, which would seem to be in favor of keeping to the target language. However, is it that clear? Is all the time using the mother tongue, is it wasting time? And it probably isn't. This is my opinion anyway. There are situations where students are exposed to English, use English, but not actually learning. For example, if they're hearing a text which they don't understand, or if they're doing busy work without learning, sort of getting into groups, getting out of groups, drawing things, framing things, formatting things. Word games like Hangman spend a lot of time exposed to English, but not actually learning very much. Coloring, formatting, setting up games and so on. There are situations where the use of mother tongue may in fact increase real learning time. For example, quick translation of a new vocabulary item instead of a long explanation in English, which the students may not understand. Quick translation can save time, which can then be used for exposure to English, or clarification of an error. You're making this error because your mother tongue does this, and it makes it easier for the students to understand why they're making the error and to avoid it. Grammar explanations, complex instructions. If I'm doing a fairly complex group work activity, then it makes sense to give the instructions quickly in mother tongue so that I have more time for the students actually to do the activity itself. These and other issues are discussed in the researchers, a book by Hall and Cook, 2012, research by Laufer and Gilsai on using mother tongue versus not using mother tongue in teaching vocabulary, both of which come up in favor of a certain amount of use of the mother tongue. My position, I think that 80 or 90% of the lesson should be in English. Firstly, I'm very much in favor of a lot of English, obviously. But having set this baseline, I would certainly not outlaw the mother tongue. The more advanced the class, obviously, the more English could be used. And my position is that it's okay and desirable to use the L1. Firstly, where students would not understand the English. There's no use exposing the students to a language which they don't understand. They're not going to learn anything. Reminds me of a little story. I was in Turkey giving a talk, and I was talking about using mother tongue. And excuse me, one of the people in the audience got up and said, well, I was visiting an English language kindergarten the other day, kindergarten where English was used all the time with students. Obviously, their mother tongue was Turkish. The children, sorry, not the students. He said, I talked to one of the children. I said in Turkish, do you understand what the kindergarten teacher is saying? And the child said, of course I don't, it's English. In other words, of course I don't. English is something you don't understand by definition. And this is not what we want. We want them to understand the English. We want them to hear comprehensible input. Another place where it is important for them to use L1 is in order to explain or prevent errors, because a lot of errors are based on contrast on L1 interference, and if they understand the interference, it can help them avoid the errors. Or where use of L1 saves time. I already gave the example of explaining the meaning of a new word or giving instructions. It saves time, which can then be devoted to engaging with English. So that's my position on L1. I don't think we should feel guilty about it. I think we should use it, not too much. We need to preserve the main use of the target language in the language lesson, but L1 can be very helpful and important. And indeed, it's a natural resource for anyone learning another language. My fourth topic is one which I discussed. Excuse me, I'm not recovering from COVID, but I am recovering from a bit of flu, and so I apologize for occasional coughs. Experience versus research. This is a topic which, when I was in virtually in Uzbekistan last year in Tashkent, I discussed this. Some of you may have heard that talk and will know my position on it. But for those of you who haven't, this is a key controversial topic. What is the best source of knowledge for teachers? Experience or research? And there are conflicting approaches here. You get Alan Maley, who says categorically, academic research has relatively modest value for teaching and learning. On the other hand, the academics themselves say things like academic knowledge is an important basic source of professional knowledge. So again, where does that leave us? It's a definite controversy out there in the field. And if we look at the research, the literature on expertise, research on expertise shows that experience is in fact the key factor in professional expertise, not again, but professional. And they talk about, you see, a lot, if you feed this phrase into Google, novice versus expert, you'll find hundreds of thousands of hits. It's sort of assumed that the opposite of an expert is not a non-expert, but a novice. In other words, what is key here is whether you're a beginner or whether you have experience. It's the experience which makes you an expert. And this applies to other professions as well as teaching. I've come across this in medicine, law, nursing management, psychiatry, all sorts of things, social work. And there is research also which backs this up, and you may know Schoen's key work. It's an old one, but it's still a classic, The Reflective Practitioner. That reflection on experience is the key factor in attaining professional proficiency and effectiveness. If this is so, if experience is the key factor, then what is the place of research? Well, it has a place. I don't agree with Alan Maley that it's negligible. I think it is important, even if it is not the main source of knowledge. It can provide us with insights and information that we could not get from our own experience. It enables us to understand things that perhaps are ideas that we would not otherwise have encountered. And it enables us to progress beyond a ceiling that we could only get from our own experience. It has a place, and it has, I think, an essential place in teacher knowledge. It can help us confirm previous assumptions, add more depth and detail to previous knowledge, provide new information, or in some cases destabilize. And I'm going to give you an example in a second. Make us rethink previous assumptions. I've always thought this, but oops, the research is showing me something different. Maybe I should think again. Let's look at each of these four. And again, those of you who are with me in Tashkent will have experienced these ideas before, but those who have not, I think they are interesting. Confirm previous assumptions. First of all, I always thought explicit grammar teaching was important. I'm very happy to have it confirmed by research, and this is a study I've already mentioned in an earlier topic. And it's been confirmed in various other studies as well more recently. Add more depth and detail to previous knowledge. Error correction. I always thought that it was important to correct, and it is important to correct. Some Canadian researcher, Lister, has done a lot of research on corrective feedback and comes to the conclusion that yes, it is effective, but what he adds is what kinds of corrective feedback are more effective. So in their research, Lister and Ranter looked at 6 different kinds of oral correction. Recast, which is just the student says, he going, and the teacher says, he is going, simply recasts the utterance correctly, just repeating it correctly. Elicitation is when you say he and ask the student to try to self-correct. Clarification request is when you ask them, what do you mean? Looking for meaning and asking them to clarify and hopefully self-correct also. Metalinguistic feedback is when you actually explain the grammatical point. In the present continuous, you should be, the present continuous, you should use the verb to be before the main verb. Explicit correction is actually saying to the student, no, that was wrong, making sure they understand it was a mistake. And repetition is when you repeat the error with a sort of rising inflection, which implies that it was wrong. Keep going, and hopefully the student again will self-correct. Now, of all these, the most commonly used in the classroom is the recast. These are the statistics they came up with. Mostly teachers just recast. The problem is that recast is, in terms of uptake, in terms of evidence that the students have understood and taken on board the correction, it's probably the least effective. So teachers do it most often. It may not be optimally effective in producing uptake and actually doing its job in getting students to understand they've done something wrong and correct themselves. I'll come back to this with relation to another topic later on, but this in general is the overall result. The third topic of third function of research is to provide new information or ideas, and this, I think, that one of the clearest instances of this is corpus-based studies. Frequency lists telling us how frequent a particular word is. I found this very, very useful in my own work, and a lot of teachers have as well. And this is corpus research. And the fourth one, destabilize, make us rethink previous assumptions. I always thought that, and a lot of teachers think that, guessing new words from context is important and useful and better than just telling the students the answer yourself, but it may not be so. An old piece of research by Ben Susan and Laufer found that of 70 unknown unknown words, the researchers themselves found that for 29 of them, there were no contested clues. They couldn't have been guessed even by a native speaker. There were partial clues for 28 and clear clues for 13. And when they gave them to the students, they found the students were able to guess correctly only 17 out of the 70. Nasaji later did some research on the same thing using students' speak aloud protocols. They were actually saying how they were guessing the words as they guessed them. And he used text, which mostly they understood, so they should have been able to guess. But in more than half the cases, the learners guessed wrong. And I've done lots of experiments with teachers also trying this out. And it seems to be in general true that even if you are very, very proficient in the language, on the whole, less than half of words can be correctly guessed from context. So general conclusion is, if your aim is vocabulary learning rather than the general reading comprehension, if you want the students to learn the word, then asking students to guess the meaning from context is probably not worth doing, because they'll usually guess wrong. It's better in most cases just to tell them the answer, and then you've saved time, because guessing takes a lot of time. Use the time for active review of the item when they already know what it means. So with regard to research then, my position is that academic is a minor but significant contributor to teacher expertise. And as far as possible, teachers should try to be aware of research evidence that can supplement their own practice. Easier said than done, of course, because teachers are busy people, and it's difficult to find time to read the research, and the amount of research coming out there is astronomical. You can't possibly keep up with it all, which is one of the advantages of events like this, where you can hear people talk and learn about different research studies that have been carried out that are relevant to practice. Okay, on to my next my next topic. You may have been told that when students are speaking in the middle of fluent speech, one should not interrupt them in order to correct errors. It's not that simple. There's a paradox here. If you don't correct, then they may, the fact the student has made the error and not been corrected may actually reinforce the error, and it may become fossilized and more difficult to correct later. If we do, then if we do correct using unobtrusive recast very, very quickly, just recast just to not interrupt too much, but we've seen that recasts are not very effective. If we correct more effectively, if we do say, wait a moment, you said that wrong, let me correct you. Using explicit feedback, we may damage the communicative value of the activity. And where does that leave you? Well, let's look and see what the research says. Probably in most cases, it appears that immediate corrective feedback is more effective rather than saying, wait, I'll wait and I'll give you the correction later, which is what a lot of teachers say, this is my solution, but it may not be effective. Giving the correction when the error actually occurs appears to be more effective than waiting and doing it later. And there is evidence that the learners themselves prefer it. A set of young adult learners asked whether they wanted to be corrected while they were speaking, or they'd rather the teacher waited until later. Most of them said they wanted to be corrected while they were speaking. And as we've seen, quick recasts are probably not effective. My position on this is as follows. I think it's a localized decision basing, as it were, profit and loss. How much is it going to disturb them if I stop them and correct them, versus how much is it going to help them if I correct the error? And it's a delicate balance. Which is more important of the two aspects you see on your screen there? And it's a difficult question. There's no easy answer. I don't think it's true to say you should not interrupt students or you should interrupt students. Neither of those is very helpful. It's a question of there is no absolute rule about when or not to correct, and it'll depend on a lot of professional considerations. There are lots and lots of decisions we make during a lesson on our feet, where the pros and cons sort of flash through our minds. We say, well, I'm going to decide to do it this way, I'm going to decide to do it this way. It's a very rapid decision. And the kinds of things that go through our minds are, well, what are the aims of the course? The aims of the course for the student to pass an exam where grammatical accuracy is going to be really important, in which case I want to correct them, or the aims of the course just to get them to speak, in which case I probably won't. The culture of learning, what is accepted practice in this particular culture. The personality of the student, if it's a shy student who is at last getting up and speaking, I'm not going to interrupt them because I really want them to be encouraged to speak. But if it's a confident student who's making a mistake that they shouldn't be making, then I probably will. Motivation, the sheer number of mistakes, I can't correct them all, obviously, and trying to correct them all will be very discouraging. So that's a reason for not correcting, or correcting only some of the mistakes. How important the mistake is, the excitement level of the activity, and perhaps most important of all, students' own preferences. And this is a case where I think it really helps to ask the students frankly, do you want me to interrupt you or don't you want me to interrupt you, even younger students, and to take that into account when I take my own decisions about correcting or not correcting. Two more topics to cover before I end. Number 6, the native speaker versus the non-native speaker as the ideal model for English. I don't know if you ask your students, I'll talk about the research on this in a minute, but many students will tell you, I want to speak English like a native speaker. Intuitively, that's what they feel. And many kids of language schools will only take native speaker teachers. I'll leave you to read that for yourselves, but this is a fairly common requirement, regardless of whether the native speaker teachers can actually teach English well or not. Who do the students prefer? That I said I'd say about the research. There's also research that most students do prefer to have native speakers as their teachers of English. But there are some very valid arguments against the native speaker being the ideal model. Firstly, there's the question of why do we learn English? Why do our students learn English as opposed to other languages? If you're learning Spanish or French or Chinese, you're learning it in general in order to communicate with members of the target language community. So if you're learning Spanish, you're learning it in order to speak to Spanish speakers. If you're learning Chinese, you're learning it in order to speak to Chinese speakers. This is not true of English. English is learned primarily in order to speak with or within the international non-native speaker community. You are more likely to be speaking English with someone else whose native language is not English, but who speaks a language which you do not understand, they do not understand your language, and they are using English as a means of communication. And this is the predominant function of English today in the world. So it doesn't make sense to be like an English native speaker. You're not going to be trying to speak to native speakers, or much less than you will be non-native. The second argument is that it's mission impossible. You can never be a native speaker of a language not your own. By definition, you're not a native speaker of that language. You can learn to be very, very proficient. So why set up an impossible target for students? Why not aim for high-level proficiency by international standards instead? And I think that is the goal which we should be aiming for ourselves: maximum effective proficiency in English for international purposes. And the third argument is that the native speaker may not be a good model. When I first started teaching English in a non-English speaking country, I assumed that my own native dialect was the one they wanted to learn. Actually, it wasn't. It's not international English. There were some aspects of my own idiolect, my own dialect, which were not appropriate for international speech. And I needed to unlearn them and learn the international versions. So if a native speaker teaching in Uzbekistan or Spain or Europe, anywhere, if they are teaching there, they need to learn the norms of international English, not teach their own local variety of English. And the fourth argument is that the non-native local teacher is likely to be, firstly, a good model and an effective instructor. If you are speaking the same mother tongue as your students, then you can say, with justification, I speak English proficiency and also my mother tongue. If I can do it, so can you. I, as a native speaker, a speaker of British English, I can't say this to my students. A teacher who is a native speaker of the local language can say it and also is likely to understand the problems and how to cope with them. So bottom line, my position is that we as English teachers, firstly, should promote the view of English as an international language rather than as the language of the Brits or the Americans, and that the standard model should be the competent speaker of English as an international language, and essentially which language that teacher spoke as a child, their original language, is irrelevant. What is important is that they today speak English well and can teach it well. Okay, my final topic. Textbooks are useful versus the use of a textbook de-skills the teacher. I come across this with a lot of conferences, that people think that textbooks de-skill the teacher. Different teachers spend variable amounts on textbook activity, and it very much depends on where you are and what the local culture is, and what the requirements are of your Ministry of Education or your university or wherever you're teaching. Finally, also the expectations of students and parents. So it's a very, very variable situation here. And there is no particular research, no evidence that I've found anyway, that teachers who adhere closely to the textbook are less skilled, or conversely, that teachers do not use coursebooks are any better. There doesn't seem to be any evidence either way. And another factor to take into account is that I don't think slavish adherence to the textbook is in fact possible. There's considerable evidence that teachers do worldwide considerably and substantially adapt their teaching materials to their classes. My own experience with textbook is that in school teaching, and I spent many, many years teaching elementary, intermediate and advanced students in state schools, I could not have managed without a textbook. I was teaching between 20 and 30 hours a week. I could not have time to search my own materials or texts or tasks. Possibly in more privileged settings, in private language schools, the teachers can do so, but most of us who are working full-time in state institutions, it's just not practical. You need the textbooks. Also, many textbooks are excellent. They can't be perfect, but they're excellent. There's a question of selection. No coursebook is perfect, and no coursebook is ideally situated to any particular learner population. You're going to have to adapt to some extent. How much will vary from what the material is to and what your class is, what your student population is, and your own preferences and experience and ideas. So, bottom line, my position on this one: the use of a recipe book does not de-skill a chef, does it? It's just a help, and the chef can take the recipes and use them and increase this ingredient, that ingredient, change it a little bit. But the use of a recipe book is really helpful to a chef. Similarly, the use of a course book does not de-skill a teacher in the same way as a chef can vary recipes. So the teacher can use the course book as a basis and vary the way they use it. For novice teachers, it may even end skill. In other words, it may add to their skill, it may help them, it may be a valuable support. So a good teacher will use a textbook as a syllabus, as I did, to give structure and a sense of progression, and as a useful bank of texts and tasks. And a good teacher will use the textbook and know how to adapt, discard, and add for various reasons, to add learning value, interest, make available to a wider range of levels within the class, make it more heterogeneous, and to make more appropriate for a particular target student population. It may not be exactly appropriate to your class. You may need to adapt to make it more suitable. So those are my 7 controversies. Thank you very much for your attention. And if we have time, I'd be happy to answer questions. Over to you. Thank you. But please speak to the microphone, otherwise I won't be able to hear you. Yeah, I can see you clapping, I can't hear it. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions?
I can't hear, if someone is saying something, I can't hear it. Please speak into the microphone.
Do you have any questions?
Okay, we will go to a short coffee break and we'll continue at 12 sharp with Victoria Clark from British Council participating in our event.
Thank you very much, Dr. Penny. We appreciate it.
Hello? I'd have a question if no one else does.
Yes.